There is a seed of courage hidden, often deeply it is true, in the heart of the fattest and most timid hobbit, waiting for some final and desperate danger to make it grow.
Welcome to the Wayward Wizards podcast. Today we are reading Book 1, Chapter 8 of The Fellowship of the Ring, Fog on the Barrow Downs. My name is Fatty Lumpkin. Here in the flesh is Logan Robertson.
Redigar Bulger.
Yeah, second character named Fatty in so many pages. Like,
Tolkien was kind of a... He I mean, you know, times change, but
he was from a different time, Logan.
I've seen videos of him. He wasn't like Mr., you know, he didn't look like Ian McKellen or somebody, you know. He
wasn't quite trim, you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, he looked like he wrote fantasy novels for a living. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, he looked like he stayed up late into the night drinking and smoking with his friends and
doing math about the moon. I mean,
doing moon math and elf propagation math.
Yeah. So we're still at Tom's house to start this thing off.
Still at Tom's house. So basically what happens in this chapter is that they say goodbye to Tom and Goldberry and they get walking through the old forest. They're trying to get back to the road and they get caught up yet again in a trap of unimaginable horror.
Yeah.
They bite off way more than they can chew.
Yeah.
Just right out of the gate. Basically everything that Tom warns them not to do in the previous chapter, they do within a couple hours. Yeah. So, I mean, it's honestly like we get some of the scariest content of the entire book in this chapter. Would you agree?
Yeah, it's scary. I don't know. The stakes don't feel as high here as the old forest in some way. I mean, I enjoyed the chapter, but I guess knowing that, I don't know, maybe the first time I read it, I didn't like realize that Tom was going to come to the rescue. But you know, the fact that they sort of have that like little song that they can sing and he can just come and fish him out. Maybe the stakes are a little lower than like Moria or something like that.
Moria is pretty terrifying. You're right in this book,
because Moria is just like running from this like horde, you know, of like of orcs that are like hell bent on their destruction, and
the Balrog is pretty terrifying.
The Balrog, and then like Weathertop is pretty scary too.
Okay, good call, because that's even in this same that's in book 1 of Fellowship.
Yeah.
So that's coming right up.
So all of that is pretty scary. Some of the Shelob stuff in the third book is pretty.
Oh, Shelob is terrifying. The Paths of the Dead are really scary. Yeah, I guess you're right. I mean, there are like horror elements throughout Lord of the Rings. I think people maybe don't really talk about that.
Yeah, I've never heard it talked about as like horror elements, but they truly are horrifying, and the way they get interpreted in art and in the movies and stuff. I think it like plays on those horror tropes.
Yeah.
So, but I do think this is scary. I mean, there's, especially if you're a little younger, you know. There's this like undead arm like crawling.
A disembodied arm walking on its fingers.
It's like walking on its fingers. That's pretty scary.
That's terrifying.
And you don't really know what it is, and you know it's dark, and it's like weird how like they're all laid out like they're dead, and
I was so deeply confused by this scene when I read it for the first time.
Yeah,
because the first like adaptation that I listened to was the NPR radio drama,
and
I don't think they have this at all in there. So I remember reading it and like going up to my dad and being like, "Hey, they're wearing dresses
Who changed their
and
clothes? That's kind of weird.
oh, I hadn't thought of that, but yeah, I mean they would have had to like well, and then like immediately after they get rescued, Tom tells them to run around naked in the grass, which I think is
That's right.
so funny. Just this image of Merry and
Yeah,
Pippin just frolicking,
just naked,
just naked,
rolling around in the dew.
sun's out, buns out, just.
Sun's out, buns out with Samwise. That's a T-shirt right there.
I wonder if Sam was like okay with like just full frontal nudity, like with his friends, or if he was just kind of hanging. Yeah, I think Sam, self confident enough just to be in the buff. But yeah, I guess like one question I wanted to kind of start the podcast with is like very similar to the question that I asked last episode. Do you like this chapter?
Yeah, I do.
I think so too. I mean, it's very, very. I think like last time when I asked that question, I kind of like chickened out and said, I like it, but I don't like it. But I'm glad that it's in. But it probably should have been cut out. Yeah, I think this is kind of in the same territory. But what do you think?
It does feel. It feels a little extraneous. There's something kind of interesting about the Barrows, and then we get some like deep history stuff.
Yeah.
Which I think actually, I realized reading this time that the first time I read this, and I'm going to go forward in the chapter quite a ways here. Yeah. It's 142 in my edition. The first time I read this, they're getting the swords from Tom, and he talks about the men of Westerness. They were foes of the Dark Lord, but they were overcome by the evil king of Carn Doom in the land of Angmar.
Yeah. Angmar, yeah.
Angmar. Few now remember them, Tom murmured, yet still some go wandering. Sons of forgotten kings walking in loneliness, guarding from evil things, folk that are heedless. That might be a reference to Aragorn, but
it's 100%. It's the Rangers.
But as I was reading this time, and I just read it recently, but this time as I read it, I realized that the first time I read this was the time that it dawned on me how much backstory and world building and stuff Tolkien had done, and that this was the point where I was like, wow, this feels so real because of these kind of details.
Like I have no idea who these people are or like what they did or like who he's talking about, but it feels like it's fully fleshed out. Yeah.
It's so fleshed out, and like I want to, who are the men of Westerness? I want to know, and I want to know this story about the Dark Lord and the evil king, and and this ancient place where there are these burial mounds of people who've led whole lives and lived through stories just as big and impactful as Lord of the Rings, and so I love it for that.
That's a great way of putting it.
I love it for that reason. I love it as just a glimpse into like this like deep history that's there.
Yeah, I love the feeling of, and I think this is something that I said to you about the Silmarillion, which is that once I actually got through the Silmarillion and felt like I understood what it was about, I realized that each of the like subsequent stories could themselves had been a novel the length of Lord of the Rings, and it would have been just as good. Like he just didn't have 17 years per story to write an epic the way that he wrote Lord of the Rings, but he probably would have if he could have. Like, Children of Hurin, as good as Lord of the Rings, for just like when you look at a summary of the story, as good. Baron and Luthien, if you just look at the summary of the story, could have been like a Lord of the Rings length novel just as good.
Right.
The Fall of Gondolin, and those are like the three big stories from the first age. But even the second age stuff, like the Numenor stuff, all this stuff here that he's talking about, the Witch King of Angmar, all that happens in the second age.
Yeah.
That could have been its own, epic. Right. So I love how you put that, that like each one of them could have been their own Lord of the Rings if he'd lived to 200 years old or whatever.
Yeah, right, exactly. So I think for that reason, the chapter works for me. And it's good to see the hobbits kind of introduced to some danger, and Frodo, have to stand up, for his buddies and all that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I like it for that reason.
The bravery that Frodo shows is really exceptional.
Yeah.
And you kind of get a sense of like, okay, this is why Gandalf trusted Frodo to go off on his own. I think for me, it's like, it does feel at times like the stretch between them leaving Hobbiton and arriving at the Prancing Pony almost feels like its own book. The tone is just so different.
It's kind of a little novella. And I think, there doesn't feel like there's a lot of, I have no idea how long it's been since they left Hobbiton.
Yeah.
And especially with the Tom chapters, I'm like, were they there for like a month? Like, how long were they there?
Yeah.
But it turns out it's like not that long at all, right?
No. I actually texted you last night because I was like laughing myself because we've now been doing the podcast for like about, this is podcast magic insight, kids. But Logan and I have been talking about doing the podcast and then actually like recording up to this point for like about like 6 months, I would say. Yeah. And like we are just to the point of Tom Bombadil's house or whatever. And I looked it up and they leave the day after Frodo's birthday. So that's the 23rd
of September.
And yeah, September 23rd. And their ordeal in the Barrow Downs is on September 28th. So like we are 5 days. We are 5 days into this journey.
It does feel like it's been a long time, and they spend, a very long time. They spend basically 2 chapters, half of a chapter, and then a full chapter, and then another chapter, with Tom. And and so, but it hasn't been long at all. And so for them, on day 5, for them to have this, another kind of harrowing experience kind of makes sense. It's good pacing. I think it's not as slow as it maybe sometimes feels. But should we get into some of the plot of this chapter?
Yeah. So they say goodbye to Tom. They after they've already get started, they say goodbye to Goldberry. I mentioned last time how Goldberry definitely has some like echoes of Galadriel. Yeah. She's almost like kind of like a proto Galadriel character. And these stories were written like long before Galadriel was even a character in Tolkien's mind. Mm-hmm. And so like you can definitely see like a very similar thing happens when they say goodbye to Galadriel. They like say goodbye to her after they've already left. Mm-hmm. And they kind of wonder like if they'll be able to say goodbye to her.
It definitely feels like Gimli when Frodo stops. They're going to go up this last, it says they've just dismounted to lead their ponies up the last steep slope when suddenly Frodo stopped. "Goldberry," he cried, "my fair lady, clad all in silver green. We have never said farewell to her, nor seen her since the evening." He's like all of a sudden compelled to kind of, give her a farewell. And after Gimli meets Galadriel, he's like never shuts up about her,
he's like so haunted by her.
Yeah, he's so enchanted by how beautiful and majestic she is that he's always talking about her and kind of spilling into these romantic declarations of his admiration for her. And that definitely feels like this feels like a kind of first echo of that kind of.
Absolutely. But they do get to see her and say goodbye to her. And she says, "Speed now, fair guests, and hold to your purpose. North with the wind in the left eye, and a blessing on your footsteps. Make haste while the sun shines. Farewell, elf friend. It was a merry meeting." Mm-hmm. And they strike off. And very soon after they depart from the house, they see a line of trees and identify it as the road. Merry is definitely the most knowledgeable of like, trekking of the group. He seems to have like a really clear understanding of the lay of the land. And he's like, "That's the line of trees. As long as we follow that, we'll get to Bree, essentially." But then yeah, calamity strikes. They stop at one of these stone structures to have lunch, and they eat the food that Tom prepared for them. And then I'm just going to read this because I think this is one of the most chilling lines in the entire story. It says, riding over the hills and eating their fill, the warm sun and the scent of turf, lying a little too long, stretching out their legs and looking at the sky above their noses. These things are perhaps enough to explain what happened. However that might be, they woke suddenly and uncomfortably from a sleep they'd never meant to take.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's chilling.
It is. I mean, that somehow enjoying the day, it leads them astray from their purpose. They don't have their eye on, and there's like some hobbitry here, you know?
Yeah.
They don't have their eye on the goal of what they need to do. They're maybe not serious enough yet about the mission that they're on, you know?
Yeah. They take their eye off the ball.
They take their eye off the ball, and they you know, they're looking at the sky above their noses. They're laying on their backs, looking up at the sky.
I wonder how they fell asleep. They were like stretched out after having eaten too much.
Yeah, in the sun. Like, of course they're gonna fall asleep, you know. And then once they wake up, the sort of world around them has really changed.
Yeah, it's almost like a mirror image, like a nightmarish turn of events.
All of a sudden there's fog and
it's cold and it's wet and there's just something feels off. There's like an iciness to the world where it was once bright, and that's when things start to turn awry.
And then they do what you really shouldn't do is panic. And they immediately panic. They spring to their feet in alarm. They run to the western rim. You know, they find out that they're in this island of fog. They're just totally dismayed. And it says they felt as if a trap was closing about them.
Yeah.
It says they didn't quite lose heart, but they, certainly can't see what they had seen before, which is where the road was and how far it was. And
and you really get a sense of like just how cold it is. It says like their hands are cold, their fingers aren't like working the way they want them to.
Their cloaks and hoods became bedewed with gray drops.
Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I underlined that word. Bedewed. I did too.
Last night when I was reading it, I read it as bedwed.
Bedwed? Yeah,
like,
dude, me too.
I was like, what's bedwed? And then I was like, oh no, bedewed.
They got bedwedded?
Bedwedded? Oh dear.
But yeah, it says they packed up as quickly as their chilled fingers would work. So it's like, I think all of us have had that feeling of like kind of being out in the weather without being dressed up appropriately, and then the cold kind of catches you.
Your joints get kind of stiff.
Yeah. I mean, like growing up in Texas, I hadn't realized how necessary gloves were, because in Texas, if you go out when it's cold, like eventually your hands will just kind of warm up. Yeah. But there are times when like it's so cold that your hands just will not get warm again. Like you have to be dressed properly.
In South Dakota, if you blink, your eyelashes will freeze together. So
yeah, exactly.
It's disgusting. It's definitely an experience I had as a kid. Getting all bundled up, it takes 15 minutes to get out the door.
So I mean, it's not quite that cold here. I mean, they're just like, they're wet and they're chilled, and
it's almost
just
worse.
Gone from.
Actually, it's almost worse. That wet cold is awful. Really,
it just drains you. It drains you. Like, I would almost rather it be like 20 degrees and snowing than
absolutely
40 degrees and raining.
Absolutely,
because that'll just take all your energy out of you.
Yeah.
But also it's foggy, and so like they had this like really clear line of sight because they're in an elevated place. Mm-hmm. They had this really clear line of sight to the road, and so they knew like, okay, as long as we head that direction, we're gonna hit the road, and then this will all be a memory. Mm-hmm. But because the fog is so thick, they start out in a line, and the order goes like Frodo, Sam behind him, Pippin behind him, Merry behind him, and they're leading their ponies in a straight line. It says once they were through the gap, they had only to keep in on anything like a straight line, and they were bound in the end to strike the road. But as happens when there's thick fog and you're already panicked, they get separated, and they clearly don't walk in a straight line. They end up going off path, and Frodo looks back and he finds that he's the only one there. Just terrifying stuff.
Yeah, Pippin and Merry. Well, yeah, he says, Sam, Pippin, Merry, come along. Why don't you keep up?
Yeah.
And he says it. Then he says it again. He says, now he's kind of running around. Sam, Sam, Merry, Pippin. He loses his pony,
which is disaster. Like if this pony runs away, like good luck getting it back. This thing is gone.
In fear, right? Like
yeah, this thing is gone. Like you're not going to get it back.
Later on, Tom says that he kind of praises the pony's wisdom or whatever. That like they did the right thing. They were smarter than you, hobbits.
Yeah, they smelled danger and they ran away. You guys walked right into it. Yeah, exactly.
Walked straight into it.
They went off and found Fatty. They found Fatty Lumpkin.
That's right. The bravest pony of them all. So Frodo's alone, but he starts to hear
their cries for help.
Frodo, hoy! Help, help! Often repeated.
Terrifying.
Ending with a last help that trailed off into a long wail suddenly cut short. That is scary.
Frodo in his desperation, he's like stumbling, alone in this deep fog, and he finds that he's back on one of these burial mounds. He's all alone, and he cries out, "Where are you?" Both angry and afraid. Here. A voice deep and cold that seemed to come out of the ground. I am waiting for you. No, said Frodo, but he did not run away. His knees gave, and he fell to the ground. Nothing happened, and there was no sound. Trembling, he looked up, in time to see a tall, dark figure like a shadow against the stars. It leaned over him. He thought there were two eyes, very cold, though lit with a pale light that seemed to come from some remote distance. Then a grip stronger and colder than iron seized him. The icy touch froze his bones, and he remembered no more. And then he wakes up in a barrow.
And we were very directly told a Barrow Wight had taken him, and he was probably already under the dreadful spells of the Barrow Wights, about which whispered tales spoke. Because the hobbits have stories about the Barrows.
Right.
And he dared not move, but lay as he found himself, flat on his back upon a cold stone, with his hands on his breast, which is like a, funereal pose. And he's just getting his, he takes a while to get his bearings. It talks about how afraid he is. His fear was so great that it seemed to be a part of the very darkness that was round him. So there's no distinction between the darkness of the barrow, he's underground, and then and his own fear, are kind of one flowing into the other. He thinks about Bilbo and their stories. It's like, this is scarier than just hearing a story about some of this stuff. He's scared, but he's not totally scared. There's as we started the episode,
there's a seed of courage hidden often deeply, it is true, in the heart of the fattest and most timid hobbit, waiting for some final and desperate danger to make it grow. And that's where we get the line that Bilbo and Gandalf thought him to be the best hobbit in the Shire. And I think we see that here. But, he's still terrified. I mean, he sees a pale greenish light growing all around him. And he sees Sam, Pippin, and Merry clad in white, with many treasures all about them. And across their three necks lay one long naked sword.
That is weird.
Oh, just absolutely chilling. I yeah, I can't help but remember like the first time I read this, just being like, what? Like what is going on here? And then he hears a song. Cold be hand and heart and bone, and cold be sleep under stone. Never more to wake on stony bed, never till the sun fails and the moon is dead. In the black wind the stars shall die, and still on gold here let them lie, till the dark Lord lifts his hand over dead sea and withered land. And so we find out pretty quick that whatever spirit is overtaking them here is in league with the Dark Lord, and is kind of like looking forward to this time when Sauron will overtake the entire world, you know, like will ruin the sea and wither the land. And yeah, it's absolutely terrifying. And that's when we get the long arm groping, walking on its fingers towards Sam, who was lying near us, and towards the hilt of the sword that lay upon them. So this like disembodied arm walking on its own fingers is going to grab that sword hilt and just slit the necks of Sam, Merry, and Pippin. Just absolutely not a children's book anymore.
Yeah, it's such a great image. Definitely chilling. Then Frodo thinks, I got to get out of here.
Yeah.
Even though
he thought of wild escape.
Yeah, even though he feels like he has been turned into stone by an incantation, he has a sort of thought of himself running free over the grass, grieving for Merry and Sam and Pippin, but free and alive himself. And it says Gandalf would admit that there had been nothing else he could do, but the courage that had been awakened in him was now too strong. He could not leave his friends so easily. He wavered, groping in his pocket. Is he looking for the ring? I suppose so.
Yeah.
And then fought with himself again. And as he did so, the arm crept nearer. Suddenly resolve hardened in him, and he seized a short sword that lay beside him, and kneeling, he stooped low over the bodies of his companions. With what strength he had, he hewed at the crawling arm near the wrist, and the hand broke off, but at the same moment the sword splintered up to the hilt. It's an indication of how old these swords are.
Yeah.
Or maybe there's some, magic in the, well, maybe, this disembodied arm certainly has some magic animating it. Maybe it kind of interacts with the sword in some way.
Right.
There's a shriek and the light vanished. In the dark, there was a snarling noise. So it's not just this arm. There's something else in the, in the barrow with him also.
Yeah. This like animating spirit that's like embodying this corpse.
And it takes all of this, for Frodo to remember that Tom had taught them a rhyme. And in a small, desperate voice, he began, "Ho, Tom Bombadil." And then just the name,
Tom Bombadillo.
Tom Bombadil. With that name, the voice seemed to grow strong, or his voice seemed to grow strong. It had a full and lively sound, and the dark chamber echoed as if to drum and trumpet. Even the rocks will, shout out, right? "Ho, Tom Bombadil, Tom Bombadillo, by water, wood, and hill, by the reed and willow." And it doesn't take long for Tom to show up.
Yeah. And he comes in and, he sings his sort of his catchphrase. If it was like a 1950s like superhero radio drama, this would be when the music would come in. And
yes.
Yeah. It's like, "Old Tom Bombadil is a merry fellow. Bright blue his jacket is, and his boots are yellow." And then he says, "None has ever caught him yet, for Tom, he is the master. His songs are stronger songs, and his feet are faster." And so he says, "Get out, Wight, vanish in the sunlight, shrivel like the cold mist, like the winds to go wailing, out into the barren lands far beyond the mountains. Come never here again. Leave your barrow empty. Lost and forgotten be. Darker than the darkness. Where gate stands forever shut till the world is mended.
He kind of casts him into hell or something, like into the void.
He like exorcises this demon, but like it's like that very last bit when he says, "Where the gates stand forever shut till the world is mended." Like there's this like hopefulness to it. You know, like eventually the world will be mended. Like there's brokenness now, but eventually the sunshine will come in and all darkness will be cast away.
Right. I love the detail we get where, they pull the Merry and Pippin and Sam out. He asks Frodo for help, which is such a sweet little detail.
Yeah, he's like, I need your help moving their bodies.
And then Tom goes back in and stomps the rest of the lich to death. It's so great. Not lich, the Barrow Wight, whatever it is in there.
What's that word you used? Lich? I've never heard that before. Is it like a
lich? A lich is, well, it's a fantasy word. It's like any. That's what I think of the Barrow Wights as liches. Probably because I played Ultima Online before I ever read Lord of the Rings, and liches are one of the mobs, one of the enemies that you fight. Okay. And so a lich is kind of like in some sense, it's like any kind of undead, reanimated corpse.
Okay, I see.
But I also think of a lich as like a wizard who has given his soul over for power, or has been kind of corrupted in some way by like evil magic. So Tom goes in and we just hear that there's a sound of much thumping and stamping. So he's like stamping these bones down,
He grabs a bunch of treasure and basically says like, this is free for anybody who comes by, like, man or beast or elf to claim for their own. And in the same way that he commanded the Barrow Wight to, flee beyond the edge of darkness, it says he raises his right hand in a clear commanding voice. There's that word command again, like again and again, it comes up with magic, but he says in a clear commanding voice, "Wake now, my merry lads, wake and hear me calling. Warm now be heart and limb. The cold stone is fallen. Dark door is standing wide. Dead hand is broken. Night under night is flown, and the gate is open." And the hobbits spring up. And that's where we get, I mean, there's a few things. I mean, you get the kind of comical image of them looking down and being like, what the heck am I, like, where are my clothes? How am I, why am I dressed up like this, sir? Said Sam. Where are my clothes? And that's where we get Merry saying, of course I remember the men of Carn-dûn came on us at night and we were worsted. Ah, the spear in my heart. And so he has this image of like being, one of these men of Westerness who is now in this northern kingdom of Arnor, and the Witch King of Angmar and his forces come and put a spear through his heart. It's absolutely chilling stuff.
Yeah.
So this would have been like a memory from a battle long before, when the Nazgul was the king of a kingdom called Angmar, and he was known as the Witch King. Yeah, Tom says, "Hey, sorry to tell you, but you're not going to get those clothes again. So, cast off these cold rags, run naked on the grass, while Tom goes a hunting."
That's great. Tom goes and he sings. We don't really know where he's going to go, but he sings this, another song. "Hey now, come, hoy now, whither do you wander? Up, down, near, far, here, there, yonder. Sharp ears, wise nose, swish tail and bumpkin, white socks, my little lad, and old fatty lumpkin." And when you read that, you're like, what is he talking about? But then later on, he interprets it for you, and he says they answered to new names that Tom had given them for the rest of their lives. So that's the names of the
ponies.
ponies.
Yeah.
Sharp Ears, Wise Nose, Swishtail, and Bumpkin. White Socks, my little lad, and Old Fatty Lumpkin. Good. I guess those are good enough names for ponies. I don't know.
I love it, but it seems like they're like he like kind of like understands their names that are like inherent to them.
Yeah,
like
those are their names.
Yeah.
He like draws those names out of them or something like that.
Yeah, like Mary couldn't possibly have known because he can't speak to horses or ponies, but Tom can. And there's a great line, as we kind of come to the end of this story, really, this end of this chapter. Mm-hmm. As the hobbits are running around naked, says the air was growing very warm again. The hobbits ran about for a while on the grass, as he told them. Then they lay basking in the sun with the delight of those who had been wafted suddenly from a bitter winter to a friendly clime, or of people that, after being long ill and bedridden, wake one day and find that they are unexpectedly well, and the day is again full of promise.
Mm.
And this is something that Tolkien would have had firsthand experience of. He got very ill after his time on the front lines in the trenches of World War I. And he was bedridden for months and months, and never returned to active combat. But he would have had firsthand experience of what it's like to be sick in bed for months at a time, and then just wake up one day and realize that you have a life ahead of you. I think the despair that comes from a prolonged illness, and then waking up one day and realizing that you have a future. It's just a beautiful, beautiful image.
It definitely feels like the image of the fog having lifted is a nice way to kind of externalize that too, I think.
Yeah. They feel the sunshine again.
To go from sunshine into fog and darkness and, all of that, and then back into the sun is a really beautiful image of what it feels like to get better. So the ponies get back,
and then they get their swords, which is a very, very important plot point.
Totally.
That, like, really up until like my most recent rereadings, I did not understand. But track these swords throughout the entire story, because it says each of the hobbits were given a dagger, long, leaf-shaped, and keen, of marvelous workmanship, damasked with serpent forms in red and gold. They gleamed as he drew them from their black sheaths, wrought of some strange metal, light and strong, and set with many fiery stones.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that these were forged many long years ago by the men of Westerness. They were foes of the Dark Lord, but they were overcome by the evil king of Carn Dûm in the land of Angmar. So these are swords that were forged by the Númenóreans to fight the Witch King of Angmar.
Mm-hmm.
And Merry and Pippin, they have these swords, and when Merry and Pippin later are abducted by the orcs, they lose them. But great care is given to show that Aragorn recovers these swords and returns them to Merry and Pippin. And then finally, on the fields of Pelennor, when Éowyn and Merry are standing over the body of the dead king, and the Witch King of Angmar comes in on his winged mount, and Éowyn does battle. Who is it that stabs the Witch King, like in the back of his leg? Freaking Merry. And what sword does he do it with?
Yeah, one of these.
The sword that centuries before was forged for the very purpose of fighting the Witch King of Angmar,
right,
by the Númenóreans. And so, like, no other sword could have done what that sword did. Um, and so, yeah, just track like how Tolkien makes sure that you remember that they have these special swords. So maybe that's the answer to the first question that I had at the beginning of the chapter. Like, do we like this chapter? Like, should this chapter have been cut out? Maybe, but then Tolkien would have had to find a different way to.
Yeah, they got to get a magic dagger somehow.
Yeah, yeah. If for nothing else, if Mary wasn't in that exact spot with that exact dagger, the Witch King couldn't have been defeated.
Yeah.
And so for nothing else, I think that this chapter, it's good that it wasn't cut out.
I think so too. Yeah, I think so too. So we're told it's time to start again. They get ready. They pack their bags. They get their ponies, ready to go. I like the detail that their new weapons they hung on their belts under their jackets, feeling them very awkward and wondering if they would be of any use. I think we just answered that question. Fighting had not before occurred to any of them as one of the adventures in which their flight would land them. They're still thinking about themselves as just going to Bree.
Or to Rivendell.
Well, to Rivendell, but Bree is the next spot. You know what I mean? And I think they really thought they would just walk there. 5 days ago when they set off, it's a little walking will do me good. I'm flabby and this and that. And, I'll have to tighten my belt eventually. And it's like, they've already, run from Black Riders, walked through an evil forest, chilled with two magical beings, and contended with, undead kings under these like old hills.
Definitely, like they bit off more than they could chew, and this is the most exciting 5 days of their lives.
Absolutely.
And they're already kind of exhausted.
And they now they're carrying these these swords, and it feels awkward to have this extra weapon or this extra bit of gear with them. Tom sees them off, trotting gaily beside them. I love the detail here. Well, first of all, he's either trotting beside them or on Fatty Lumpkin, who could move much faster than his girth promised. Fatty Lumpkin's like a super pony. And then Tom sang most of the time. This is like the thing that annoys people about Tom. It annoys me. Maybe I'm, I don't know. Maybe people aren't as annoyed as I am, but I'm annoyed by his nonsense language. However, it says that although it was chiefly nonsense, it says, or else perhaps a strange language unknown to the hobbits, an ancient language whose words were mainly those of wonder and delight.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned that, in the last episode or the episode before, that there's the rhyming, the kind of, even though it's nonsense, it still, feels like language.
Yeah.
And I think that is, made pretty clear here that he's not just talking nonsense. He's uttering things. He's code switching, right? He's going from one language to another. And the language that he's using is sort of more fit for expressing wonder and delight than whatever language the hobbits are speaking, right?
Right.
And so that's a nice detail.
I think that's definitely an echo of we haven't talked about the Inklings like a terrible amount, apart from just Tolkien and Clive C.S. Lewis. But probably apart from C.S. Lewis, probably the most influential of the Inklings to Tolkien was Owen Barfield, who I didn't know really anything about until a few months ago. I read the book The Fellowship, The Literary Lives of the Inklings, which is very much extensively researched and beautifully written by a husband and wife team. But I really knew nothing about Owen Barfield, that he probably the most influential thing on Tolkien is the idea that language has sort of devolved and devalued over time, and that if we were able to go back in time and really see the roots of language, like the ancient words of language, that they would like perfectly describe the things that they signified,
mm-hmm.
and that they would just be pure expressions of delight and wonder.
Mm-hmm.
And that sign and signifier would be essentially one.
Yeah.
And that's definitely something that Tolkien, writes into his language. It's like the idea of de-evolution, that the past was better than the present, and that we're in a constant state of decline and death.
It's very Catholic also, right? I mean, this idea that nothing ever actually gets better. There's just glimmers of hope in the, increasing disorder and chaos that continues to be sowed into reality until the eschaton. And
until the world is mended.
Yeah, until the world is mended. And so there's a deep hopefulness, even though things are kind of increasingly appearing to be darker and darker.
I love that Frodo, after all of this, Frodo says, "I suppose we haven't lost more than 2 days by my shortcut through the forest."
A little tongue in cheek, I think.
But perhaps the delay will prove useful. It may have put them off our trail.
Yeah, sure.
So it's kind of like this reminder of like, oh crap, like all of that was just kind of like a side quest. They were like, enhancing their XP.
I was just going to say that they got a little XP boost from that side quest.
But the real danger is the servants of Mordor,
right,
that are hot on their trail. And Pippin says hesitantly, "Do you think we may be pursued tonight?" Like that's like the poor guy. I mean, it's like they went from danger to relative safety with Fatty Bulger, and then they decided to take a shortcut, which made a long delay, and they got eaten by a tree.
Yep.
And then they were saved by Tom Bombadil, and then they got captured by a Barrow Wight, and now they're just like back to being pursued by these Black Riders. I mean,
from danger to greater danger.
From danger to danger. But yeah, you wanted to mention Bombadil.
Tom says goodbye. He says, "I'll give you good advice." Well, he says it in the third person because of who he is as a person. Tom will give you good advice till this day is over. They're going to go 4 miles, come to a village, Bree and Bree Hill, with doors looking westward. He says, "Go to the prancing pony, find Barliman Butterbur. He's a worthy keeper." And then they beg him to come, the hobbits, because he's given them their greatest sense of safety since they left the Shire.
Yeah.
Or since they left Hobbiton. And Tom says, "Tom's country ends here. He will not pass the borders. Tom has his house to mind, and Goldberry is waiting."
Yeah.
He is not going to leave his country. And it made me realize that Tom is the opposite of Gandalf in many ways. They're the same kind of being. They are both infused with a goodness, but Tom stays in his country. He wears bright blue and yellow, and he sings everything he says.
Yeah.
Gandalf is gray and brings with him, later on we're told that, people, there's like a foreboding when he shows up because it brings problems.
Yeah, ill news. Yeah.
He's this, he's this gray presence, and he's a wanderer. Yeah. And so and then at the end of the story, we're told that Tom or Gandalf says, "I've been a Rolling Stone, and Tom is a moss gatherer."
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there's definitely, they're two sides of the same coin, or they're two, they're like this dualism or something like that. But they serve a similar purpose, or exist, exist for this as an expression of, part of the song of creation that is certainly has its own kind of theme. But they do so in kind of different modes or something.
Well said. I think it's the colors are an interesting comparison that I never made the connection to.
Yeah.
But also, like you said, the fact that Tom is like bounded by his home, where he's master. Just before the bit you read, he says, out east my knowledge fails. Tom is not master of riders from the black land far beyond his country. So it seems like, I remember like being a kid and being like, okay, so Frodo has this like cheat code where if he's ever in danger again, he can just sing the Tom Bombadil song. And
right.
But no, only in the borders of his own country does he have this mastery. Another like comparison between, or a contrast between him and Gandalf is just like their general mood. Like I wouldn't call Gandalf a jolly, or merry fellow. He's sarcastic and he's grumpy.
Even sort of put upon. He's like, I gotta go down south and check something. He's
like, oh, you fools. You like
foolish hobbits, right?
Yeah. It's he has like kind of a impatience, like when Frodo's like, why didn't Bilbo just kill Smeagol when he had the chance, or Gollum when he had the chance? And Gandalf has this great line where he's like, well, I think it's a sad story, and I think it might have happened to some hobbits that I've known.
Mm-hmm.
He's very quick to kind of put people in their place.
Right.
But yeah, he's told the four hobbits are told to go to the Inn of the Prancing Pony. Sam is thrilled, and he's like, I hope it's like the Green Dragon.
Yeah.
And they say their farewells to Bombadil, and he rides off on Fatty Lumpkin, tossing his hat in the air. And Frodo reminds his companions that the name of Baggins is not to be said, that he's Mr. Underhill from here on out. And they go off towards the inn, desiring only to find fire and a door between them and the night.
Mm.
And that's the end of the story, or the end of the chapter, rather.
Cool chapter.
So next week,
a lot going on.
Cool. Yeah, cool chapter. It feels like a different book to me.
It does. It's its own little. It's its own little novella. It's especially and we talked about the changing of the tone a few times, but I think the Prancing Pony feels monumental in some way.
Yeah. I think it's when the story really starts. It's like the journey really. Well, maybe after the Council of Elrond is when it really feels like Lord of the Rings to me. But
yeah, that may be true. Mm-hmm.
Next week we get Strider.
Yeah,
introduced into the story,
aka Aragorn,
son of Arathorn, King Elisar, whose name means hope.
That's right. Yeah. It's chapter 9 of Fellowship. Chapter 9, book 1, at the sign of the Prancing Pony.
So we'll see you guys then.
Yeah, don't forget to share the podcast with a Lord of the Rings fan in your life. And of course, you can follow us in all the places if you already don't, and visit waywardwizards.com for more info.
Until next week, y'all, be bold but wary. Keep up your merry hearts and ride to meet your fortune. We'll see you next week.